Your private property ends where my authority begins, Mr. Vance. The words hung in the humid afternoon air, thick and greasy, like the diesel fumes chugging from the idling tow truck behind her. Karen Miller, the self-appointed empress of Crimson Ridge Estates, stood on the edge of my driveway, a clipboard clutched to her ample chest like a shield of divine right. Her floral print muumuu, a riot of angry pinks and bilious greens, seemed to vibrate with her indignation. She pointed a perfectly manicured, sausage-like finger at the olive-drab vehicle parked 20 yards deep onto my own land, a 1968 Kaiser M715 military Jeep that I had spent the better part of 3 years restoring to its former glory. It was my tribute to my father, who drove one just like it in another lifetime, in a place very far from this manicured suburban battlefield. "That thing," she declared, her voice dripping with a special kind of contempt reserved for anything that didn't match the HOA-approved palette of beige, taupe, or greige, "is an unregistered commercial vehicle and a public nuisance. It violates covenants 7.14, 9.02, and 11.36. It's an eyesore, and it's being removed." The tow truck driver, a lanky kid who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, shifted his weight nervously, avoiding my gaze. I stood on my porch, hands resting loosely on the railing, my expression as placid as the summer sky above. I'd dealt with tyrants before, some with far more power than a clipboard and a misplaced sense of grandeur. This was just a different kind of insurgency. "Karen," I said, my voice even and calm, a tone I had perfected over 30 years on the bench, "that is my personal vehicle, registered as a historical automobile, parked on my private property, a full 2 acres of which was specifically deeded as exempt from Crimson Ridge covenants when I purchased it 5 years before your HOA even existed. The tow truck driver will attach a hook to it over my dead body, and I assure you, you will be joining me in the afterlife shortly thereafter, buried under a mountain of litigation so tall it will cast a shadow over your entire beige kingdom." That got a flicker of something in her eyes. Not fear, but a deeper, more venomous anger. She was unaccustomed to resistance. This was her fiefdom. Before she could unleash her next volley of bureaucratic nonsense, I want to take a moment and thank you for being here. If you enjoy stories about bullies getting exactly what they deserve, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had your own run-in with a power-tripping HOA board. Your stories matter, and they remind us we're not alone in these fights. Now back to Karen and her little power play. She puffed out her chest, the floral pattern straining at the seams. "Threats will not work on me, Mr. Vance. I have the bylaws, I have the authority, and you have 10 minutes to move that junker before it's impounded at your expense. The fines are already accruing." She made a show of scribbling something onto her clipboard, a flourish of pure, unadulterated power. I just smiled, a slow, deliberate expression that didn't reach my eyes. She had no idea who I was. She had no idea what I was capable of. She thought this was a battle of wills over a vintage Jeep. She was about to find out it was a war, and she had just tried to invade a sovereign nation of one. She had fired the first shot, and in doing so, she had handed me all the ammunition I would ever need. The game, as they say, was afoot. And I, Judge Arthur Vance, retired from the federal bench but not from the fight for justice, was about to teach Karen Miller a long, painful lesson about the true meaning of authority. My history with this land ran deeper than the shallow foundations of the surrounding cookie-cutter houses. I bought the acreage, a 10-acre plot with a sturdy but weathered 1950s farmhouse and a magnificent old barn, almost a decade ago. It was my escape, my sanctuary after a long career in the federal judiciary, a place where the only laws that mattered were the laws of nature. The property was an island of green, bordered by a centuries-old stone wall on one side and a slow-moving creek on the other. When the developer, Sterling Homes, bought the surrounding farmland to build Crimson Ridge Estates, they had to negotiate with me. My property sat right at the planned grand entrance. My lawyer was meticulous. The sales agreement for the sliver of land they needed for their entrance road contained an ironclad exemption clause, notarized, filed with the county, and cross-referenced in the master deed for the entire development. My 10 acres, later reduced to 8 after the sale, were explicitly and permanently excluded from any future homeowners association, its covenants, its rules, and its reach. For the first few years, it was peaceful. The houses went up, families moved in, and I was just the quiet old guy in the farmhouse with the big barn. I'd wave to people on their morning teas. They'd admire the wildflowers I let grow wild in my meadow. Then 6 months ago, Karen Miller was elected HOA president. She had moved in 2 years prior, a retiree from some mid-level corporate management position, and she carried the bitter, officious energy of someone who had never had real power but had always desperately craved it. Her first act was to rewrite the bylaws to grant the president emergency enforcement authority. Her second was to form the Architectural and Aesthetic Review Committee, which she alone chaired. Suddenly, the friendly waves were replaced by suspicious glares. The first notice appeared in my mailbox a week after the Jeep incident. It was a crisp, professionally printed violation letter, complete with the Crimson Ridge logo. The violation? Unapproved landscaping, Section 8.04, overgrowth and wild flora. The fine was $50 per day. My meadow, the one filled with black-eyed Susans, Queen Anne's lace, and milkweed for the monarch butterflies, was now a violation. I wrote a polite, formal letter back, citing the exemption clause in my deed and attaching a copy for their convenience. I explained that my property was not under their jurisdiction. I expected that to be the end of it. It was not. The response was from Karen herself. "Dear Mr. Vance," it began, the politeness a thin veneer over a core of pure condescension. "While we appreciate you providing the historical document, the board has reviewed the matter and determined that for the safety and aesthetic harmony of the community, all properties adjacent to Crimson Ridge must adhere to basic maintenance standards. The exemption clause is interpreted by the board as pertaining to structural additions, not landscape maintenance. The fines stand." It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. She had simply invented an interpretation that suited her. This was no longer about a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate campaign. I was a challenge to her absolute authority, and I had to be brought to heel. I started a file. The first 2 letters went into a crisp manila folder labeled HOA on the correspondence. I had a feeling it was going to get thick. The notices began arriving like clockwork, a weekly testament to Karen's boundless creativity in manufacturing grievances. Following the wild flora violation, I received one for an unauthorized structure. The structure in question was my barn, a beautiful silver-gray behemoth that had stood on this land for 70 years. According to Karen's letter, it lacked the requisite beige siding and faux stone accents required by the committee. The fine was a staggering $200 per day until rectified. I sent another letter, again attaching my deed exemption, and this time highlighting the legal definition of a grandfather clause. Her reply was even more audacious. "The board does not recognize grandfather clauses that predate the establishment of the community's aesthetic standards. The barn constitutes a significant visual blight and negatively impacts the property values of our residents." She was, in essence, declaring her HOA's 2-year-old style guide to be retroactive and superior to decades of established property law. I added her letter to the file, my methodical calm beginning to curdle into a cold, focused anger. This wasn't just ignorance, it was arrogance of a truly epic proportion. She believed that by sheer force of will, she could rewrite reality. The next violation was for my fence, the low, dry-stacked stone wall that had been built by the original farmer in the 1940s. It was now an unapproved fencing material, Section 6.02, which demanded white vinyl or wrought iron. The absurdity was breathtaking. I was being fined for the very history that made my property unique. I decided a different approach was needed. Letters were too easy for her to dismiss with her fabricated interpretations. I attended the next monthly HOA board meeting, held in the sterile, soulless community clubhouse. The board consisted of Karen and 2 other residents, a nervous-looking accountant named Jerry and a woman named Brenda, who seemed to treat Karen's every utterance as gospel. I sat quietly in the back as Karen droned on about the importance of lawn height uniformity and the moral failing of leaving garbage cans visible from the street for more than 3 hours post-pickup. When the floor was open for homeowner concerns, I stood up. I introduced myself calmly and laid out my case, not with anger, but with cold, hard facts. I presented the deed, the exemption clause, and the timeline of my property ownership versus the HOA's existence. I spoke about property rights, legal precedent, and the simple, undeniable fact that they had no jurisdiction. So, to be clear, I concluded, looking directly at Karen, every fine you have levied against my property is legally void. I am formally requesting the board retract all violation notices and cease this campaign of harassment immediately. The room was silent. A few of my neighbors, people who had previously been friendly, looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear. They knew Karen's wrath. Karen listened with a tight plastic smile. When I was finished, she didn't address the legal points. She didn't even look at the documents I held up. She turned to the handful of residents in the room. "What Mr. Vance fails to understand," she said, her voice oozing with faux sympathy, "is that being part of a community means making small sacrifices for the greater good. It means we all agree to a certain standard to protect our collective investment. His refusal to cooperate, to simply mow a field or paint a barn, shows a deep disrespect for his neighbors and the value of their homes." It was a brilliant, insidious pivot. She had reframed my stand on legal principle as an act of selfish defiance against the community itself. She was painting me as the enemy. The accountant Jerry squirmed in his seat, but Brenda nodded vigorously. "That's right. My realtor said the old barn is an eyesore. It's bringing us all down." I realized then that I was not in a court of law, but a court of public opinion, and the judge was a tyrant who had already poisoned the jury. I left the meeting with a profound sense of clarity. Karen Miller wasn't just a bully. She was a predator who used the flimsy shield of community bylaws to feed her insatiable appetite for control. And she had just made it personal. My legal training, especially my time in the JAG Corps, had taught me one crucial lesson. When facing an enemy who ignores the established rules of engagement, you don't argue, you document. You build a case so airtight, so overwhelming, that their narrative collapses under the sheer weight of evidence. My HOA correspondence file became my primary project. I bought a high-quality scanner and digitized every letter, every envelope postmark, every absurd demand. I set up a dedicated email address and began communicating with the board exclusively in writing, creating a pristine, time-stamped paper trail. I mounted a small, discreet security camera on my porch, aimed at my mailbox and driveway, legally on my own property, but with a clear view of any HOA officials who might venture onto my land. The footage of Karen delivering her violation notices personally, her face a mask of smug satisfaction as she slid another fine-filled envelope into my box, was pure gold. I also began taking daily, time-stamped photographs of my property. The overgrown meadow, the dilapidated barn, the unapproved stone wall, all documented from multiple angles, creating a visual record that contradicted her slanderous descriptions. This wasn't just about defense anymore. It was about building an offensive case. I knew I needed allies. A lone dissenter, no matter how legally correct, is easily dismissed as a crank. A united front is a rebellion. I started taking walks through Crimson Ridge in the evenings, not around my own property, but through the winding streets of identical houses. I wasn't looking for trouble. I was listening, and what I heard was a quiet chorus of resentment. I struck up a conversation with a young couple, the Garcias, who were frantically trying to repaint their son's small wooden playset in the garage. Karen saw it from the street. "Garcia," Maria told me, her voice hushed, as if the HOA president might be lurking in the azaleas. She said the primary colors were visually aggressive and violated the earthy tones mandate. "It's a play set for a 5-year-old. We have to repaint it forest fawn or riverstone gray before the weekend, or the fines double." I listened patiently, then shared my own story about the barn. A flicker of recognition, of shared frustration, passed between us. I met the Hendersons next, an elderly couple who had lived in the area for 40 years, long before Crimson Ridge existed. Their small, tidy home had been absorbed into the development's edge. Karen was fining them for their vegetable garden. "She says it's a small-scale agricultural operation, which is prohibited," Mr. Henderson said, his hands trembling slightly with rage. "I've been growing tomatoes in this very spot since my kids were small. Now this woman is telling me my tomatoes are a violation." It was a pattern of predatory enforcement. Karen wasn't targeting the flagrant rule breakers. She was targeting the vulnerable, the young family who couldn't afford a legal fight, the elderly couple who were easily intimidated. And me. She saw me as an old man, isolated on his large property, an easy target to make an example of. She couldn't have been more wrong. I gave the Garcias and the Hendersons my card, not my old judicial one, but a personal one with my name, phone number, and email. I have a legal background, I told them, choosing my words carefully. I'm not practicing anymore, but I'd be happy to help you draft a formal response to the board, citing the relevant state statutes that protect homeowners from this kind of overreach. No charge, of course, just neighbors helping neighbors. Their relief was palpable. For the first time, they saw a path other than capitulation. My little insurgency was gaining recruits. The true escalation came a week later. A certified letter arrived, a far more official and ominous document than the usual violation notices. It was from the HOA's legal counsel, a firm I'd never heard of called Pike and Sterling. The letter informed me that due to my persistent and willful refusal to comply with community standards and pay outstanding fines, the Crimson Ridge Estates HOA had placed a lien on my property for the amount of $12,750. A lien. For a meadow, a barn, and a stone wall that weren't even under their jurisdiction. It was a declaration of war. A move so audacious, so legally unsound, that it could only have been born from the desk of a bully who had never ever been told no. They were trying to cloud my title, to effectively hold my property hostage. I looked at the letter, at the name of the law firm, Pike and Sterling. The name Sterling rang a bell, a faint chime from a case file I'd glanced at months ago, something about property management. I set the letter down on my desk next to the growing stack of evidence. The file was no longer just about correspondence. It was now a full-blown investigation. The lien was a blunder of epic proportions on Karen's part. For a layperson, a lien is a terrifying legal instrument, a spider web of consequences that can affect your credit, your ability to sell your home, and your financial freedom. To me, it was a gift. It was a formal legal action, and it elevated our dispute from the petty realm of bylaws and violation notices into the arena I knew best, the law. An improperly filed lien is not just voidable, it's grounds for a lawsuit for slander of title. Karen and her board, in their arrogant overreach, had just handed me a loaded weapon. But I wasn't going to buy her head just yet. A good strategist never uses his best weapon until the most opportune moment. First, I needed more intelligence. The law firm Pike and Sterling was my starting point. The name Sterling kept nagging at me. I spent a few hours in my home office using the legal research databases I still had access to as a retired senior judge. It didn't take long to find it. Sterling Management Solutions was a massive regional property management company that specialized in overseeing HOAs, and they were notorious. A quick search revealed a trail of lawsuits, homeowner complaints, and news articles painting a picture of a company that encouraged and empowered aggressive boards. Their business model seemed to be built on fines and fees. They took a percentage of every violation penalty collected, creating a perverse incentive for their client HOAs to become predatory enforcement machines. Karen wasn't just a rogue tyrant, she was a franchisee of a corporate bully. And Pike and Sterling was their in-house legal muscle, a firm that churned out threatening letters and baseless liens like a factory. But it was the big one, the case that had been tickling the back of my memory, that had made my blood run cold with a thrill of recognition. O'Connell et al. V. Sterling Management Solutions. It was a federal class action lawsuit filed on behalf of homeowners from a dozen different HOAs managed by Sterling. The allegations were damning: racketeering, conspiracy to commit fraud, illegal property seizures, and systematic abuse of the lien process. They were accused of using fraudulent surveys to claim community ownership of private land, levying massive unpayable fines, and then foreclosing on the liens to seize properties for pennies on the dollar. The case was a monster, and it was currently winding its way through the U.S. District Court for our state, my old court. I downloaded the entire case file, thousands of pages of motions, depositions, and evidence. I spent the next 2 days reading, my old judicial instincts kicking in. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was analyzing a complex legal battle, seeing the patterns, the strategies, the weaknesses. Sterling's playbook was laid bare before me. Step 1. Identify a target, usually a homeowner with desirable land or one who questions authority. Step 2. Bombard them with frivolous violations. Step 3. Refuse any attempt at reasonable discussion, always hiding behind the board's interpretation of the rules. Step 4. File a massive, intimidating lien. Step 5. When the homeowner is financially and emotionally exhausted, present a fraudulent survey claiming a portion of their land is actually common area and offer to forgive the fines in exchange for the land. It was the exact strategy being deployed against me. Karen wasn't a brilliant tactician. She was just following a script. Armed with this knowledge, I expanded my neighborhood reconnaissance. I created a simple, anonymous online survey about residents' experiences with the HOA board and posted a link on the unofficial community Facebook page. The questions were neutral. Have you received a violation notice in the past 6 months? Do you feel the rules are enforced fairly and consistently? Do you believe the HOA budget is being managed transparently? The response was overwhelming. Within 48 hours, I had over 100 replies in a community of only 200 homes. The data painted a grim picture. Over 70% had received a violation notice. 95% felt the rules were not enforced consistently. People listed their grievances in the comments: fines for having a satellite dish on the wrong side of the roof, for planting unapproved flowers, for holiday decorations left up 2 days too late. But the most telling data was in the crosstabs. The vast majority of violations were targeted at the newer, younger families and the few older residents on fixed incomes. The established residents, the ones in Karen's social circle, were virtually untouched. I saw a photo of Karen's own backyard, posted by a disgruntled neighbor, showing a large permanent gazebo that had never been submitted to the architectural committee for approval. It was a clear, flagrant violation of the very rules she so zealously enforced upon others. I now had data, a pattern of abuse, and a clear understanding of the enemy's grand strategy. The next move was Karen's, and I knew exactly what it would be. The fraudulent survey was coming. I was ready for it. The official notice for the special community meeting arrived a week after the lien. The agenda was deceptively simple: discussion and vote on a proposed boundary adjustment and community beautification project. To the average resident, it sounded harmless, perhaps even positive. But I knew better. This was it. This was the land grab. I had already preemptively hired my own surveyor, a man named Bob, who had been working in this county for 40 years and knew its property lines like the back of his hand. He came out with his high-tech GPS equipment and his team. They spent a full day on my property, cross-referencing my deed with the original county plat maps and physical markers. "Your lines are rock solid," Judge Went told me, rolling up the freshly printed survey map. "That stone wall? It's 2 feet inside your property line. The creek is the official boundary on the east. There's no ambiguity here. Not an inch." He confirmed that the iron pins he located at the corners of my property were the original undisputed county markers. I paid him for his work and for a certified copy of his report, which I added to my growing file. I then took my evidence, the data from the community survey, the photographs of Karen's unapproved gazebo, the stories from the Garcias and the Hendersons, and the information about Sterling Management's lawsuit, and put together a concise, powerful presentation. I wasn't going to let Karen control the narrative at her special meeting. I was going to host my own. I called it a community information session and invited everyone I had spoken to, encouraging them to bring their neighbors. We met not at the sterile HOA clubhouse, but in my barn. I set up folding chairs, a projector, and a screen. The evening of the meeting, over 50 people showed up, a mix of curious, angry, and frightened residents, their cars lining my long driveway. They looked around the barn, my supposed visual blight, with a sense of wonder. With its high vaulted ceiling, massive hand-hewn beams, and the warm glow of string lights I'd put up, it felt less like a nuisance and more like a cathedral. I stood before them, not as a judge or a lawyer, but as their neighbor. "Thank you for coming," I began. "I know many of you are concerned about the direction our community is heading. You're worried about unfair fines, selective enforcement, and a lack of transparency from our HOA board. You have every right to be. And tonight, I want to show you that you're not alone. For the next hour, I laid out the case. I presented the survey data in clear, easy-to-read charts, showing the undeniable pattern of targeted harassment. I showed the photo of Karen's gazebo next to a copy of the violation notice the Garcias received for their son's playset. The hypocrisy was stark and undeniable. I explained the business model of Sterling Management Solutions, how they profited from fines, and I told them about the federal class action lawsuit for racketeering. The mood in the barn shifted from quiet resentment to open anger. People started murmuring, nodding, sharing their own stories with the people sitting next to them. Then I put up a slide with a simple message. What can we do? I outlined the provisions in the HOA bylaws, Karen's own weapon, for calling a special election to recall the board. It required a petition signed by 25% of the homeowners. We don't have to live like this, I said, my voice ringing with conviction. This is our community. These are our homes. We have the power to demand accountability. By the end of the night, a petition was circulating. I had signatures from nearly half the community before the last car pulled out of my driveway. We had formed a united front. The rebellion had officially begun. The Garcias and the Hendersons, once timid and afraid, were now energized, acting as lieutenants, talking to neighbors I hadn't reached. We were a movement. Karen must have heard about the meeting in my barn immediately. Her response was swift and predictable. 2 days later, a man from a surveying company I didn't recognize was on the edge of my property, planting little pink flags that traced a new imaginary property line, a line that cut a 30-foot deep triangle off the corner of my meadow, the very corner visible from the entrance to Crimson Ridge. The next day, the official notice for the seizure arrived. It included a copy of the new fraudulent survey commissioned by the HOA. It claimed a historical deed error had been discovered, and the corner of my land was, in fact, HOA common area. The beautification project was a plan to build a massive brick and wrought iron entrance sign, complete with a fountain and manicured flower beds, right where my meadow currently stood. The notice stated that the community would vote to reclaim the common area at the special meeting. It was a checkmate move in her mind. She thought she had me cornered, that I would be forced to fight her bogus survey in a long, expensive civil suit. She didn't realize I wasn't playing chess anymore. I was dropping a bomb on the whole board. The day of the special meeting, a strange calm settled over me. I had spent the last few weeks preparing for this moment, not just building a case against Karen, but also making a few discreet phone calls. As a senior judge, even in retirement, I still had colleagues on the bench and connections within the federal court system. One of those calls was to the clerk for the chief judge of our district. I explained without going into excessive detail that I had become personally aware of evidence directly pertinent to the O'Connell v. Sterling management case. I mentioned that the presiding judge was set to retire in a month and that the case would need to be reassigned. I simply inquired about the process for reassignment, nothing more. It was a breadcrumb, a tiny seed planted in the fertile ground of the court's administrative machinery. The rest I would leave to fate and bureaucratic procedure. I put on a simple navy blue blazer, a crisp white shirt, and gray slacks. It wasn't a suit of armor, but it felt like one. In my leather briefcase, I had 2 files. One was my meticulously organized evidence against Karen and the Crimson Ridge HOA. The other was a single, freshly printed document from the federal court's electronic filing system. As I walked to the clubhouse that evening, I saw that the community had turned out in force. The parking lot was overflowing. Inside, the room was packed, standing room only. My allies, the Garcias, the Hendersons, and dozens of others who had signed the petition gave me quiet, determined nods. They had organized, spreading the word, making sure people understood what was truly at stake. Karen was at a lectern at the front of the room, flanked by her 2 loyal board members, Jerry and Brenda. She was beaming, soaking in the power of the moment. A slick-looking man in an expensive suit sat in the front row, a representative from Sterling Management, no doubt, here to witness the final victory of their well-honed playbook. Karen banged a gavel, a theatrical gesture of her absolute authority. "Welcome, residents of Crimson Ridge," she began, her voice booming with false bonhomie. We have a very exciting opportunity before us tonight, an opportunity to finally complete the grand entrance our beautiful community deserves. She launched into her presentation using a slideshow filled with artists' renderings of the proposed monument. There it was, a garish brick monstrosity with crimson ridge in gold script, sitting squarely on my land. She then brought up the fraudulent survey map, presenting it as undeniable fact. As you can see, she said, pointing a laser at the altered property line, a recent survey has uncovered a small error in the original plat maps. This little corner of land has always, legally, been community property. Mr. Vance has been enjoying it through a simple misunderstanding. She didn't mention my own certified survey. She didn't mention my deed exemption. She was telling a simple, compelling lie. The board proposes a vote to formally reclaim this common area and proceed with the beautification project. This will raise all of our property values and create a lasting first impression of quality and elegance. She opened the floor for discussion, but it was clear she expected no real dissent. She likely assumed my allies and I would argue about the survey, getting bogged down in a technical debate she could easily shut down with a bang of her gavel. She called on a few of her known supporters first, who dutifully praised the project. Then she looked at me, a smug, challenging glint in her eye. "Mr. Vance, I'm sure you have something to say." I stood up and walked calmly to the front of the room, my briefcase in hand. I didn't go to the microphone set up for residents. I stood directly opposite her, at the other end of the board's table. I placed my briefcase on the table and clicked it open. "Thank you, Karen," I began, my voice carrying easily through the silent, expectant room. "You are correct. I do have something to say. Several things, in fact." I didn't look at the residents. My focus was entirely on her, on the board, and on the man from Sterling Management. "First, regarding the land, you claim to have discovered a deed error. This is a falsehood. I have here a certified survey conducted by a county licensed surveyor with 40 years of experience, confirming my property lines are exactly as stated in my deed, a deed which, I will remind you, contains an ironclad legally recorded exemption from your authority." I slid the thick report from my first file across the table. It landed in front of her with a solid thud. "Your survey is a fabrication, commissioned with homeowner funds for the sole purpose of seizing private property. This action constitutes attempted fraud." Karen's smile faltered. Brenda gasped. The Sterling representative shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Second, regarding your leadership," I continued, my voice growing colder, harder. "Over the past 6 months, you have engaged in a pattern of targeted harassment, selective enforcement, and financial mismanagement. I have here," I pulled out another thick stack of papers, "a data analysis from over half the residents of this community documenting your abuses. I also have photographs of your own unapproved construction, proof of your hypocrisy. And I have a preliminary forensic analysis of the HOA's budget, which shows thousands of dollars in landscaping and consulting fees that appear to have directly benefited your own property and that of your board members. This is not leadership. It is corruption." The murmurs in the room grew louder. People were looking at Karen, then at each other, their suspicions now being validated with hard evidence. Karen's face had turned a blotchy, furious red. "This is outrageous. These are baseless accusations," she sputtered, banging her gavel. "You are out of order." "I am just getting started," I said, my voice cutting through her outburst. "Because this isn't just about a bad HOA president. This is about a predatory business model. Your management company, Sterling Management Solutions, and your legal counsel, Pike and Sterling, have a well-documented history of this exact behavior. In fact, they are currently defendants in a major federal lawsuit for racketeering and conspiracy to commit fraud under the RICO Act." The man from Sterling went pale. He looked like he was about to be physically ill. The name of the act, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, hung in the air like a death sentence. "The playbook you've been following, Karen, the frivolous fines, the baseless lien, the fraudulent survey, it's all laid out in the plaintiff's evidence in that case. Your actions here in Crimson Ridge are about to become a key part of that federal lawsuit." Karen was on her feet now, her whole body trembling with rage. She pointed a shaking finger at me. Who do you think you are? You can't just come in here and slander us with these wild theories. You're just some retired old man with a grudge. The board's decision is final. The law is on my side. She practically screamed the last words. The entire room held its breath. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the second file, the one with the single piece of paper. I let the silence stretch, savoring the moment. I looked from Karen's enraged face to the terrified man from Sterling, and then I let my gaze sweep across the faces of my neighbors, my allies, the people who had been bullied and intimidated for so long. Actually, Karen, I said, my voice now dropping to a quiet, lethal calm, the law is not on your side. In fact, the law is my field. And as it happens, that federal case, O'Connell versus Sterling Management, had a new development this morning. The presiding judge retired and the case was reassigned. I unfolded the single sheet of paper. It was a notice of judicial reassignment from the United States District Court. It was reassigned to a senior judge, one who has agreed to take on the case to see it through to its conclusion. I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle before I spoke them. The case has been reassigned to Senior Judge Arthur Vance. I held up the paper so the front row could see the official court seal and my name. That's me. I am the federal judge who will be presiding over the case that will determine the legality of the very tactics you are using here tonight. Your little beautification project is now Exhibit A. Your fraudulent survey is evidence. And you, your board, and your friends at Sterling Management are now persons of interest in a federal racketeering investigation. A collective gasp went through the room. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. It was the sound of a tyrant's world crashing down. Karen Miller stood frozen, her mouth agape, her face a canvas of utter disbelief and horror. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, sickly gray. Her reign was over, and her nightmare was just beginning. The immediate aftermath was pure, unadulterated chaos, but a quiet, stunned kind of chaos. No one shouted, no one moved. The only sound was the frantic rustling of the Sterling Management representative as he shoved papers into his briefcase and tried to make a discreet exit. He didn't get far. Mr. Henderson, the gentle old man whose tomato garden had been declared a public nuisance, stood up with a newfound strength and calmly blocked the aisle. I think you'll want to stay, he said, his voice surprisingly firm. I'm sure the judge will have some questions for you. All eyes turned back to the front of the room. Karen's two board members, Jerry and Brenda, looked as if they had been struck by lightning. Jerry, the nervous accountant, was visibly sweating, his eyes darting between me and Karen as if trying to calculate the precise moment to abandon a sinking ship. Brenda, who had been Karen's most vocal cheerleader, seemed to shrink into her chair, her face a mask of dawning terror as she realized she had hitched her wagon to a runaway train headed straight for a federal penitentiary. Karen finally found her voice, but it was a pathetic, reedy squeak, a ghost of her former booming authority. You can't, she stammered, pointing a trembling finger at me. That's a conflict of interest. You can't preside over a case you're involved in. A faint smile touched my lips. An excellent point, Karen, and one I am, of course, well aware of. That is why 6 weeks ago, when I first uncovered the connection between your actions and the Sterling case, I had my attorney formally file a third-party evidence submission to the court and the Department of Justice, detailing everything happening here. I made myself a witness. I knew that doing so would require me to recuse myself from hearing the case, and I did. The case has been assigned to a trusted colleague, Judge Elizabeth Ryder, a woman who has even less patience for corporate bullies than I do. But before I recuse myself this afternoon as the senior judge on duty for reassignments, I signed the order expanding the existing federal investigation into Sterling Management to include the activities of the Crimson Ridge HOA board. So you see, I am not your judge. I am your chief witness. If it was possible, Karen and the man from Sterling turned even whiter. I had not just cornered them. I had built the cage, locked the door, and handed the key to one of the toughest prosecutors in the district. Jerry, the accountant, made his move. He stood up, knocking over his water glass. I had no idea about any of this, he blurted out, pointing at Karen. She told us it was all standard procedure. She managed all the communications with Sterling. I just balanced the checkbook. I want to cooperate fully. Brenda, seeing her chance, quickly followed suit. Me too. I was just voting how she told me to. She said, Mr. Vance was a troublemaker trying to lower our property values. The board had imploded. The tyrants' lieutenants were trampling each other to save their own skins. It was a pathetic yet deeply satisfying spectacle. Karen stared at her crumbling empire, her face a mess of confusion and impotent rage. Her authority, built on a foundation of bluster and intimidation, had vanished in an instant. She was no longer the empress of Crimson Ridge. She was just a woman in a floral muumuu, about to be crushed by the wheels of a justice system she had so arrogantly underestimated. In that moment, the fight went out of her. She slumped into her chair, a deflated balloon of entitlement, and stared blankly at the fraudulent survey map on the projector screen, the blueprint of her greed and her downfall. The meeting was over. The homeowners, my neighbors, began to file out, not with loud cheers, but with a quiet, profound sense of relief and vindication. They walked past me, many of them touching my arm or whispering a simple thank you. Maria Garcia gave me a tearful hug. You gave us our community back, she whispered. I stayed until the room was empty, save for Karen, her two former allies who were now being spoken to by two sheriff's deputies I had asked to be on standby outside, and the very unhappy gentleman from Sterling Management. I packed my files back into my briefcase, snapped it shut, and walked out of the clubhouse and into the cool night air, leaving the wreckage of Karen's reign behind me. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal and communal reconstruction. The Crimson Ridge HOA board officially resigned en masse the morning after the meeting. An interim board was formed, with Mr. Henderson as the acting president, a position he accepted with a quiet, dignified reluctance. His first official act was to draft a formal, public apology to my family, the Garcias, the Hendersons, and every other resident who had been unjustly fined or harassed. The apology was posted on the community website and mailed to every home. His second act was to immediately terminate the HOA's contract with Sterling Management and Solutions and Pike and Sterling. The liens they had filed were all formally withdrawn, and a motion was passed to use the HOA's reserve funds to reimburse every single resident for any fines paid under Karen's tenure that were deemed frivolous by the new oversight committee. It was a complete and total reset. The federal investigation moved with surprising speed. Armed with my documentation and the testimony of the now cooperating Jerry and Brenda, federal agents raided the offices of Sterling Management. The O'Connell class action lawsuit swelled as residents from Crimson Ridge, emboldened by our success, joined the case. The fraudulent survey became a cornerstone of the prosecution's argument, a clear-as-day example of their criminal methods. Karen Miller was, to put it mildly, in a world of trouble. She was facing potential charges not just for fraud and conspiracy, but also for mail fraud, for sending the threatening letters and liens through the U.S. Postal Service. Her assets were frozen pending the investigation. She sold her house in a hurry at a significant loss and disappeared from the community without a word. The last I heard, she was living with a relative 2 states away, buried under a mountain of legal fees that would dwarf the petty fines she had once so enjoyed levying. The community itself began to heal. The oppressive atmosphere of suspicion and fear lifted, replaced by a sense of shared purpose and genuine neighborliness. A new simplified set of bylaws was drafted by a committee of residents, myself included, that focused on genuine issues of safety and structural integrity, while eliminating all of the absurd, subjective rules about aesthetics. The earthy tones mandate was ceremoniously abolished. The Garcias repainted their son's playset in the brightest, most visually aggressive primary colors they could find, and it became a beloved landmark in their cul-de-sac. Mr. Henderson's tomato garden flourished, and he shared his bountiful harvest with everyone. The oppressive beige conformity of Karen's vision was slowly replaced by the vibrant, diverse colors of a real community. My own life returned to the peaceful rhythm I had sought when I first bought this land. The meadow grew wild and beautiful, attracting more butterflies and bees than ever before. The old barn stood proud and undisturbed, its weathered wood a testament to history and endurance. The stone wall continued its quiet, steadfast vigil along my property line. One sunny Saturday afternoon, I finally finished the last bit of tuning on the old M715 Jeep. It purred like a kitten, a deep rumbling sound of pure American steel. I backed it out of the barn, its olive-drab paint soaking up the warm sun. The Garcia kids, hearing the engine, came running over, their eyes wide with excitement. "Whoa, is that a real army truck?" 5-year-old Leo asked, his face smeared with chocolate. "It sure is," I smiled. "Want to go for a ride?" Their parents gave me a grateful nod, and I lifted the kids into the passenger seat. We rumbled down my long gravel driveway, past the wildflower meadow, and out onto the street of the neighborhood we had reclaimed together. As we drove, I saw neighbors out in their yards, not with anxious looks, but with genuine smiles and friendly waves. The Hendersons were tending their garden. A young family was putting up a basketball hoop, a structure that would have undoubtedly earned them a hefty fine in the old regime. It was a community reborn, a place where people were free to live their lives without fear of a petty tyrant on a power trip. The victory wasn't just in seeing Karen fall, it was in seeing what rose from the ashes of her reign. A community built not on suspicion and control, but on respect, freedom, and the simple decency of neighbors looking out for one another. And as I drove my perfectly imperfect, non-compliant, gloriously historic Jeep through the streets of our new Crimson Ridge, I knew this was a victory far more satisfying than any I had ever won in a courtroom.